To be with two titans of industry, Richard Edelman and Dan Rather, to talk about trust in our institutions, in our leaders, and in our media. So without further ado, let me start with Richard. Tell us a little bit about the Trust Index. It's been running now for 17 years.
So this year, in 2017, the trust in institutions imploded. It's back to levels of 2009 after the Great Recession. And it's really a matter of never having recovered from the Great Recession, but also the further waves of the tsunami of globalization and automation. And we also see a real drop in trust in leaders, in particular in CEOs and government officials.
Right. And I also noticed, I think it's a global in nature, 80% of the countries you surveyed, I think, are lacking trust in their institutions.
Yeah, it's amazing the gap between the mass and class population, and really out of that mouth of the dragon comes populism.
Right. So Dan, I think in one of your posts you referred to this as swirling currents. Well, they seem to be swirling not only here in the U.S. but around the globe.
True.
So what comes next here?
Well, I wish I knew what comes next. If you find out, call me collect.
I'll do that.
I hope I'm at least half decent at gathering facts and what has happened and what is happening. But when it comes to predictions, the late Ed Murrow once said, when it comes to predictions, mine are not any better than the guy at the end of the bar. But in trying to be responsive to your question, I think it'll be a very unsettled time. My guess is, and I'm only guessing, it'll be unsettled for quite a while, and a particularly dangerous time.
Yeah.
There's never any really safe time anywhere on the planet, but a particularly dangerous time, not just for business and government institutions, but for individuals as well. We've never, not in my lifetime, have we seen anything such as this. The closest would be during the period of World War II, which for completely different reasons, the world was in tumult.
Right.
But both personally and professionally, I think it's all the more important to stay steady.
Yes.
A steadiness is going to be the best thing that can happen, whether you're running a business or whether you're a journalist or a carpenter or a welder. Just steady.
Steady.
But it seems to me that the difference between this year and past years is that we've gotten to a point where there's loss of faith in the system.
Right.
That there's a sense of unfairness, that the rich get too much, that I'm not going to have a better life for my kids than I have, and actually a demand for change and fundamental change. And when you have that loss of faith in the system, you're open to fears like social and economic. So immigration, or I might lose my job to a robot, or globalization. And therefore, it's all really on a knife's edge, as Dan described. And I think it makes for a very kind of unpredictable set of consequences.
Right. I was interested in the study. You highlighted the juxtaposition of fears people have, whether that's globalization or technology, and then the lack of trust in institutions. What comes first, and how do they interrelate?
Well, actually, it's the intersection of those two things that actually leads to populism. And in a country like the US, the UK, we see now in France, in Mexico, you see populist candidates coming. And some are in the left, like Mexico, some are in the right, like in France. But they're all people who are focused on nationalism. They're focused on somehow reducing immigration, going back to Beaver Cleaver in the 60s, and the two kids in the house and the car, and as it was, and that's not as it is or will be.
Right.
So and that's why people have such fear of innovation. More than half think that innovation is a bad thing. Right. That's a big red light for business.
It is. It's a red light for everybody, if I may interject.
Please.
Because I think increasingly, I think we've had a revolution that, as it was happening, none of us recognized it, and that the digital revolution, the biggest revolution we've had, at least since the advent of television. Mm-hmm. And with the digital revolution, a lot of people feel that they've been left behind. They don't understand it, they're confused by it, they're fearful of it. And many of those people, with good reason, they have reason to be fearful. So I think putting it in a broad context, we have to view what's happening not just in what we'll call the industrialized world. The world at large is trying to come to grips with this digital revolution.
Yeah.
And it does lead to fear, among other things.
Right.
And fear can be easily exploited by politicians,
Yes.
left, right, and center.
Yep.
So, I actually think that the model of the world for governance used to be a pyramid.
Right.
It used to be the power elite at the top with both power and influence and authority. And that flipped upside down now.
Right.
Where frankly, power and influence is now with the people. And they've seized it back, and they're voting no confidence.
Absolutely. And I do want to mention to our listeners that they should feel free to submit questions. But on that point, Dan, you talked about, in one of your recent posts, about the endurance of a nation. And we've seen cycles in our country over the past 5-6 decades where fear has been infused, where we've had significant change. This one feels different, and I'm just curious how it feels to you versus some of those other cycles we've experienced.
Well, again, it feels different because it is different. We Americans have never been through anything like this. People around the world can say in their own context they've never seen anything like this.
Right.
Not only is this not normal, if you pardon that syntax,
Right.
but it's unprecedented that we're moving into a whole new cosmos of problems and challenges, and they can be exploited. And when we talked about, with his studies, on how trust has diminished, particularly among people in the middle or lower socioeconomic classes, well, that trust, that loss of trust, increases the confusion factor. It increases the ability of people to exploit it. I'll give you a specific example.
Please.
We're fond of saying in our beloved United States of America to talk about the power of the presidency.
Right.
And an American president, because he is both head of state and head of government,
Right.
has enormous power, including the power to start a nuclear war. But I think one of the underestimated powers that a president has is the power of persuasion. And to persuade, you have to have trust.
Right.
We've had this tremendous diminution of trust of all of our institutions,
Right.
including the presidency.
Yeah.
And this is complicating and making the situation much more dangerous.
And another thing that complicates it is the evolution of the media sector into an echo chamber.
Right.
The only thing that people will read or hear is that which they agree with.
Right.
4 out of 5 said, I only see that kind of material. So if I'm right, I do Fox. If I'm left, I do MSNBC. And there's no town square. When you were on air, CBS was the center.
Right.
You had right, you had left, but you had an objective view. And now it's politicized. Also, people prefer search over human editors.
That was amazing.
And more than half of people say they won't change their mind
Right.
On social issues. So I think that sort of explains this idea of media accelerating the fears.
Right. So there was a drop in the Edelman survey in trust across the board,
Right.
but media saw the largest drop.
Right.
And so what's your take on that?
Well, it's a problem for us, and in some ways it's justified, and I do not accept myself from this criticism. That now more than ever what's needed is a principled, trustworthy medium which sees itself as an honest broker of information,
Right.
recognizing that news is not an exact science, it's a very crude art, and naturally we're going to make mistakes, and every mistake hurts. But the role of the media now, particularly I think moving into this new period, has got to be a reestablishment of one explaining to the public what we do, what we think we do, and do it. For example, the whole idea that we have moved into a post-truth political era, a post-fact political era. Now, while particularly free people are always walking moment to moment on the razor's edge of danger, now it's been significantly increased with the argument that, well, there are something called, quote, alternate facts. This is extremely dangerous.
Right.
A fact is a fact. 2 and 2 equals 4.
Right.
No one can argue an alternate fact, 2 and 2 equals 5. Water runs downhill. That's a fact. So we're in this period that It's very important for the press while we reestablish and say, look, folks, we're trying to be these honest brokers of information, as principled as we know how to be. What we're trying to do is establish facts and counter the so-called alternate facts. We're trying to get to the truth, or as close to the truth as is humanly possible to get.
Right.
And keep explaining to the public that that's what we're attempting to do. You can judge how well or how poorly we do it.
Right.
But on top of that, I think the media has to try to be more local and more social.
Right.
Because local, incredibly important because it gives you the sense of authority and credibility.
Right.
Social, because that's where people are. And today, the most credible source of information is a person like yourself.
Right.
So information passes peer to peer. And I think, therefore, employees are deeply important to talk to.
Absolutely.
And that's why I'm actually telling our clients that every one of them should start up their own media company.
Right.
To add to the voices of the mainstream media. Because, with the shrunken resource available, there's not going to be so many reporters available to cover every story.
This is a very important point for journalism. The idea, part of the reason that many journalists missed what was happening politically in this country with the rise of Donald Trump,
right,
is because the resources have shrunk.
Right.
So you don't have as many, this is a journalist term, as many feet on the street,
right,
which is to say you don't have people going to the Midwestern states, talking to people who have lost their jobs or fearful of losing their jobs. So this shrinking of resources, which is partly a result of the consolidation of media, but other factors come into it, leads to this echo chamber effect. Therefore, journalists have to rededicate themselves to putting feet on the street,
right,
going, talking to people, not just people at the top, but people in the middle and the bottom as well.
So Richard highlighted the fact that companies need to develop their own media systems. One could argue the White House has developed a system through social that then the media sink into. Is that the type of thing we talked off camera about former presidents first employing radio and the journalistic pool being upset that that message wasn't going through them but right to their constituency? Do you think we're in a similar time here?
I do. And the evidence of that is the success that now President Trump has had with using Twitter.
Right.
In the same way that Adolf Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in our own country saw the potential of radio in the late 20s and early 30s as a new way of reaching people. And then again in the late 50s and into the early 60s, President John Kennedy recognized the power of television. Donald Trump recognized the power of social media and used it in much more effective and to a much larger influence than any other candidate.
Yeah, it's amazing.
One really important point out of the study is business is the last retaining wall in this tsunami. Because government trust is so low, media trust has really evaporated. Business actually has a chance. When I talked about loss of faith in the system, there's those who've lost faith, there are those in the middle, and then there are those who believe in the system. For those who have a middle view, business is the most trusted institution. Those are the persuadables. And if business is going to actually do it, it has to not just be through the CEO, because CEO trust is absolutely low. It has to be by doing things, by acting not just for shareholders, but on behalf of society, by coming up with new products, by having services that actually are, somehow seen as positive, good, and listen. Listen to your employees and listen to your customers. This is a major change for business, but it's essential that they do it now.
It does seem, and this came up largely after 2008, a discussion of what kind of breed of capitalism do we need? And that's what I wanted to ask you is, do you think the fundamental role of capitalistic organizations need to evolve to take into more longer term consequences such as sustainability and things of that nature?
I fundamentally believe in the idea of markets and of business, but I think business has to have more than a quarterly view of its strategy and has to actually be clear with transparent reporting and letting customers see that, in fact, products are sourced appropriately. That's the job. And that's also the job of the CEO, not to be a turtle,
Right.
not to keep your head inside the shell, but to stand up. We've done a survey this year, and it showed that the only CEOs people could name were actually Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, who hasn't been CEO for a decade, and Steve Jobs,
Right.
who's been passed away for 5 years or more. So, you've got to be a face, you've got to somehow represent your company, but then also express more broadly through your employees.
How do you think our institutions need to evolve?
Well, first of all, the institutions do have to evolve. It can't be the same old, same old.
Yep.
And I think the institutions have to evolve along the lines of understanding that people are far more open now to new ideas, or even some ideas that we felt were discredited some time ago. For example, in talking about business, I find in talking with business people that frankly they don't recognize that capitalism is being challenged now stronger and more effectively than it has at any time since certainly the Great Depression in the 1930s. Evidence of that, an example, Bernie Sanders running for president of the United States, a 74-year-old socialist.
Right.
Now, just the term socialist would have eliminated him from serious consideration only a short time ago. But this is an indication that, and I do think not enough people recognize that capitalism has to prove itself. It has to prove itself as being not only in the service of making money, but it has to have at least some degree, a sense of public service. And for your CEO, the hypothetical CEO, certainly he has a responsibility to stockholders. But if he or she doesn't realize that they also have to have some degree of public service and communicate that to the public at large, saying, we're in business to make money, yes, and no apology for that. But we also see ourselves as part of the whole and in public service, because capitalism is on the line now.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we're going to change tomorrow, but for the first time in a very, very long time, particularly young people are saying to themselves, I'm not utterly convinced that capitalism is the best system.
Right. So we should open it up for questions from our Facebook friends. Mistakes. Have they had that kind of self-recognition moment?
I hope so, and I do believe so. I think I see some signs over the last 6 or 7 months that the media, I prefer the word press, but the
Yes.
media as a whole in this country has stiffened some. Because having said the media needs to be principled, it needs to have a sense of responsibility, but it also needs a sense of humility,
Yeah.
which we don't always have, particularly anchor people in television, such as myself, have not always have it. But I do see some hopeful signs, but we need a whole lot more of it. That look, a free and independent, truly independent, fiercely independent press, when necessary, is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. And in some ways, I think those of us in the press have lost that sense of mission.
Yeah. Richard, your firm works with media all over the world. Are you seeing this in terms of a self-recognition moment?
I think media is deeply aware of the challenge and risk of fake news,
Right.
Of sort of loss of position, of the idea somehow that it's a world dominated by Facebook and Google, as opposed to the traditional brands. And they're experimenting. They're experimenting by having much more video, by having customers have commentary on their websites, and it's a world of and,
Right.
not of or anymore.
Right, right. Another question from Facebook is, what recommendations would you have, Dan, for a journalist getting into the field who wants to report objectively, who they view their media owners not necessarily aligned with the same mission?
Big problem.
Yeah,
And no illusions.
right.
It would be very easy for me to say, well, stay true to your ideals, stay true to your principles, and I do say that. But one has to be realistic about it. I think the first thing for any person wanting to get into journalism or a beginning journalist is recognizing writing is the bedrock of the craft.
Yeah.
Dedication to writing. The other is to keep asking yourself the question, where do I stand? What am I willing to do to keep this job, to stay in the profession? and what is it that I won't do?
Right.
Because if you don't have a clear vision, that you have to be careful what you get used to, because you can get used to anything.
Right.
If this makes any sense. So
Sure.
you have to say to yourself, look, I want this job, I want to work at this television, I want to work at this newspaper, whatever. But there are things I will not do.
Right.
And whatever the cost, if necessary, I will walk. You have to know where that line is. It's the best I could do.
Yeah. You see this interesting juxtaposition of business models being challenged and then putting pressure on resources. And I think you highlighted this earlier, and then you have the emergence of fake news and trust issues. Is there a recipe for this to right itself?
I don't think there's a recipe for it to right itself, but a lot depends on those who control the largest corporations with the most national and or worldwide distribution of news. I get back to say to themselves, if only one of the 4 largest corporations that control the most distribution of news in the United States of America said, you know, I want my news division to do principled quality news, and I'm going to see it as something separate from what we do as a whole as a company, if it makes sense. If just one said, I'm going to increase, not decrease, the number of journalists we have, I'm going to give them additional resources and say to them, as a public service, we're going to operate a truly independent news operation, even if it costs us some friends in Washington who are powerful. We don't have that at the moment, and there's an aching need for it.
Absolutely. Another question for you, Richard, is the concept of self-regulate. And will business ethics be reliable if they're making a profit without considering the public welfare?
Look, I think this is the moment when business has to get beyond its traditional role of just actor and innovator. I think that there has to be some step into public policy, sketching a future for driverless cars and trucks, for example, which in the next 10 years are going to, frankly, change the working lives of drivers all over millions of people. So what's our play on pensions? What's our play on training? What's our play on safety? This has to be a public discussion, and it has to be led by business. It shouldn't wait for government, because business is actually ahead of the regulator on this. And the possibility of mass discomfort is substantial, and shouldn't wait for that. And the same thing is true on other sort of technologies that are reinventing the financial services area, the cell phone business. All these have to be discussed publicly.
Right. There's some that have posited that this evolution of technology and displacement could actually lead to social unrest. Do you see that playing out?
Certainly has the potential. When I say we're all walking moment to moment on the razor's edge of danger, that's part of what I'm talking about. That we need, in the vernacular of today, a reboot.
Right.
To zero base almost everything and say, given the digital revolution, what do we do now to reestablish public trust in our institutions, in our business, in journalism? That these are not normal times. Having said, these are unprecedented times, and it calls for a lot of careful thought and people willing to take a bold stand and bold action.
Right. Another question from Facebook. You talked about people wanting to read or watch, Richard, what they believe in to validate their views. There are some people that feel that they're getting fake news and not recognizing it. How do we counsel people to understand the difference between fake and real?
So I think you have to look at the source, and I think you have to make sure that our viewing publics are actually educated about credibility of spokespeople, and going back and checking before passing along the information in your social feed.
Right.
That in effect everybody is not just a kind of originator, but therefore an editor, because you're passing it along to your friends, and people have hundreds of friends. And by me sending it to Dan, therefore I'm passing my credibility with it. No, you better go back and check the source, just as if you were a journalist, particularly on something like, Pope Francis endorsing, whoever.
Yes.
These are stories you have to ask yourself.
Well, there are a few things that I think about more in recent days and weeks in this whole business of fake news. And we've talked a lot about the responsibility of journalists, responsibility of people in business, people in government. But the news consumer, the public, when it comes to fake news, they have a big responsibility. Yeah. They need to step up as well. And there's an old saying in journalism, you trust your mother, but you cut the cards, which is another way of saying you check it out.
Right.
And in today's environment, it's imperative when you hear something or see something that you don't immediately assume
it's true.
That's true.
Yep.
And particularly not pass it along. You need to check it out. I'll give you a specific example, and let me say I have no stock in either one of these organizations. But the Associated Press and Reuters news services, just to name two. One, they have worldwide news gathering resources. Two, they still have very high standards.
Right.
So it's just an example of you hear something on the internet, you hear something on social media or television, read it in the newspaper. You can go to some places such as the Associated Press or Reuters, and if they say it's true, there's high probability it's true. If they say it's not true, then you need to be careful. If they say we're still checking it out, then you check from time to time.
Another question, interesting question about the role and influence media plays in today's society. How much of the concept of trust is determined by the quality, objectivity, and rigor of our media? Of our media.
Yeah. Well, I'm just not sure.
Yeah.
I come back to things are fluid, things are moving around, things are turning up. And for the news consumer, for the person who's trying to make sense of it all, just think you have to pay attention, you have to check and double check. This echo chamber, which he referred to earlier, is very dangerous. You say, well, I tuned to this channel because they tell me what I already believe.
Right.
Boiled down, that's a version of, don't bother me with the facts, my mind is made up.
Right.
And no reasonable person, no person who wants to contribute to their country or humanity's welfare can take that attitude.
So I think it's partly what you say, not simply the channel, and how you say it. So Trump actually got credit from the public for being fast, for being genuine, for being spontaneous. Accuracy wasn't it wasn't perfectly accurate, but it somehow described emotion. And by contrast, Mrs. Clinton's answers were long. They were very detailed. They were somewhat circuitous. They were lawyerly, and she was therefore seen as not telling the whole story. So I think it's style points now as much as it is the channel.
Well, again, I agree, and it's a very important point, that there's no substitute for authenticity. And Donald Trump is, you can argue about what else he is, but he's authentic.
Right.
That is. The Donald Trump you see is the real Donald Trump. And so often, with journalists as well as people in politics, there's this tendency to say, well, I need to pose as something else. And that's what he's talking about when he says, in this last presidential race, perhaps unfairly. But Donald Trump came through as an authentic voice of change. And for whatever reason, fairly or unfairly, Secretary Clinton did not come through with that authenticity. And when you talk about reporters and journalists and what they can do, asking the question of, am I just posing as a reporter, or am I actually making the phone calls and wearing out the shoe leather? Is very important in carrying that authenticity to the public.
One last question for you both, and I'm going to quote you, Dan, in something you recently wrote. Time passes, wounds heal, even if scars remain. And you wrote that in the context of some difficult events the U.S. has faced in 1941, in 1963, and in 2001. Now, we're not in those type of moments, but we are in a moment, and I'm just curious, those scars, they tend to dictate political activity, business activity, and so what would you expect to see coming on the heels of this moment?
would expect to see
from our government, from our businesses, from the media, in terms of change?
I think the biggest change has to be a rededication to the idea of performing service for others. I come out of television, which is a narcissistic enterprise. But there has to be I use the word rededication, to a sense of, I want to contribute to something other than just myself. I want to belong to something that's worthwhile, that's bigger than myself. And this is where the argument, and I think there'll be a big debate, the difference between patriotism and nationalism.
Right.
There is a difference, but sometimes, and particularly at the political level, people want to confuse the two and meld the two. But the idea, the world has shrunk in terms of communication. So it's not an easy question to answer, but I think this sense of, listen, I want to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. It's very simple. It's an ancient adage, and some rededication of that will help.
And Richard, on the heels of this survey, what would you expect to change?
I think the mentality, particularly for business and government, is instead of believing that you can do things for the people, you have to do things with the people. They have to understand why and how and where and when. They don't believe you anymore unless you tell them specifically. And let them participate and let them be part of consumer panels like Airbnb and Uber and whatever. You have to allow them to have a vox populi and to feel as if they're part of the process.
Great. Well, I can't thank you both enough for joining us at the Nasdaq for this important discussion. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.